Okay, the legacy of Nelson Mandela. So I'm finally getting to this video after my computer is working again. So thanks to some experts in my friendship circle, I have gotten the computer working again. The Trojan virus is gone from the computer for the time being, and so I can make my video. I actually found some of the files pertaining to making this video. So, much has been said. My own take on the whole Mandela thing is not so much that this whole funeral regarding Nelson Mandela should be paid too much attention to. In other words, I find it just another exercise of Western hypocrisy, mostly, as it was portrayed in the Western media, by the way. It was total and utter hypocrisy. And much of this history regarding Nelson Mandela and the entire history of the ANC has largely been erased from the Western media altogether. It never played a very prominent role in its own reality to start with, but now, with all this praise during this funeral, it becomes even more evident. All this hypocrisy that has been going on all along and continues to this day, by the way. So let's just get some facts straight here regarding the support or non-support, essentially, for Nelson Mandela and the ANC, the African National Congress, during the period from 1964, when Mandela was first sentenced to life imprisonment, until a few years ago, prior to 1990, when he was released, and he actually came into power as president of South Africa. Now, this is quite a long history. It's a time span of, by now, almost 50 years. And a lot of things about all of this history has been forgotten, at least in the Western world. And it is not an easy explanation. There's nothing easy about it at all. So essentially, what we had during this entire period of time from 1964 through 1990, essentially, was a massive investment by Western governments, in gold, in diamonds, in mineral resources by companies and corporations like De Beers and other Western corporations during the apartheid regime, which propped up that regime to the hilt. So let me quote you, some paragraphs from Foreign Policy in Focus. The death of a great man is not only a time for eulogies, but also a time for the record to be set straight. A fitting time to bring some inconvenient truths and skeletons out of the historical cupboard. President Mandela was one of the great forces of freedom and equality of our time, declared George W. Bush. And yet Mandela's ANC was still on the U.S. terrorist list until 2008. which meant that Bush's own secretaries of state had to certify that Mandela was not a terrorist so that he could actually enter the United States. Nelson Mandela was a towering figure in our time, a legend in life and now in death, a true global hero, intoned David Cameron. Yet the current UK Prime Minister went off on a jolly trip to apartheid South Africa in 1989, all expenses paid by firm lobbying against all sanctions towards that regime. The veterans of the apartheid jails, the thousands and thousands of victims of tortures, and millions more scarred by the daily abuse inflicted by the white supremacist regime, know that most Western leaders did nothing to support them. During the decades of darkness and repression, the help and solidarity came from neighboring African countries, as well as from India, Cuba, and the worldwide anti-apartheid movement as a whole. In the United States, support from the Black Civil Rights Movement was in part fueled by its own struggle against racial segregation. In the UK, London dockers went on strike and refused to unload imports from South Africa. Anti-apartheid activists led a boycott against South African goods and disrupted South African cricket teams that played matches in the UK. The Commonwealth group of nations led the way in implementing a boycott of South Africa, calling on all governments to implement trade sanctions. But the UK government, under Margaret Thatcher, insisted in 1987 that she wanted nothing to do with this terrorist Mandela. And her government distinguished itself as the sole opponent of sanctions adopted by the Summit of Commonwealth Nations. Did Cameron apologize for Maggie Thatcher's bigotry rooted in this racist ideology of the British Empire? Not a bit. In Western Europe, only the Swedish government of Olof Palme fully supported Mandela and the ANC. Mandela has been lauded as a great conciliator and peacemaker, as well as the principal architect of a new South Africa. Now, in the current South Africa, this did not play out too well, and I'll get to that later. And I'll also get to why that didn't play out. Meanwhile, let's go on with this article. But many Westerners who climbed on board the right side of history long after the anti-apartheid train had left the station have bought into a revisionism of Mandela. Kind of thinking about the past, which essentially denies the reality of that time. In the wishful thinking of some Westerners, Mandela, the peacemaker, is supposed to have renounced his earlier convictions about the necessity of armed struggle and the common cause he felt with all other anti-colonial, or today we might actually say anti-globalism forces, and revolutions being waged by the frontline states of Angola, Namibia, and Mozambique at that time. In reality, Mandela, the great peacemaker and architect of the Rainbow Nation, conducted a lifelong battle against injustice. He was not and never has been a complete pacifist. The apartheid regime treated blacks as subhuman, as a subhuman species, and refused to negotiate with any black majority whatsoever. As Mandela told the BBC at the time, this left the ANC no alternative but to opt for armed struggle. In pursuit of a new South African foreign policy, Mandela reaffirmed as president his lifelong support for the Palestinian struggle and never renounced his support for the right of a brutally oppressed people to rise up. After his famous 1994 election speech and election victory, Mandela was the target of much wooing from the likes of Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Tony Blair to pressure the new South Africa to align with Western foreign policy and to ditch the ANC's close relations with Cuba, the PLO, and Libya. And look where this has ended up. Because, you know what? He actually did follow those policies. And because he did follow them, I wouldn't be quite as harsh as John Pilger likes to be on, Nelson Mandela, but because he did follow precisely those policies is why South Africa is essentially still in the mess it's in today. I mean, that's just my own assessment, but yes, that is essentially part of the problem, because you have to remember that once Mandela actually did have access to power and got into power, by that time the Soviet Union had already collapsed. And so basically what you had is a sort of uber capitalism taking over, the entire globe, making everything into a one-size-fits-all kind of game. And that didn't work out too well, because the oligarchs and shysters took over in Russia. They took over globally, including China. And this is where South Africa, like many nations, are today. So this is not the fault of Nelson Mandela. It is basically a consequence of global dynamics, which aren't exactly moving in the right direction. I mean, this is just my own commentary here, but let's go on. So yes, let us remember that Nelson Mandela actually was close to Cuba. Okay. Mandela never made any secret of his love for Fidel Castro and Cuba. Soon after his release from prison, Mandela made Cuba one of his first trips abroad. Later, Mandela accorded Fidel Castro a state visit in special honor of addressing the South African Parliament. Washington, of course, squirmed at all of this. And while Cuba was amongst the nations that trained some of the ANC guerrillas in exile and provided medical aid, the U.S. government under President Ronald Reagan famously referred to the apartheid dictatorship as our democratic friend in the West. So, you see, there are shifting alliances here. So the situation is not as black and white as you may wanna see it. It's a continuous struggle up until this very day. After Mandela, retired from the presidency, Mandela again criticized the United States over the Iraq War and President Bush's contemptuous disregard of UN and international law. If you look at those matters, you will come to the conclusion that the attitude of the United States of America is a sort of a threat to world peace, the 84-year-old African statesman said in a 2002 interview. He also vigorously attacked Tony Blair's poodle loyalty to President Bush's White House. "He's the foreign minister of the United States," he exclaimed. Mandela, that is. Mandela was always too magnanimous to ask Western leaders where their governments were during the 27 years he suffered in jail. He probably laughed about their hypocrisy, but he refused to ever dilute his ties or his closeness to his old friends and allies against apartheid, all of whom the West opposes to this very day, I might add. So many African leaders and others from the developing world attending this funeral of Mandela knew how much Western leaders contributed to the longevity of apartheid in South Africa. And it is an enduring travesty that so few words of any kind of apology ever crossed the lips of Western government leaders during all of those eulogies. So this is going to be part 1 of my video. I don't know how long I've been recording here, probably 10-15 minutes or so. So part 2 will follow in a short while. Thank you.